I occasionally still pass that rest spot, but I no longer stop. When I took the nightly delivery route via the Northern Corridor in late October, I could hardly see 20 feet past the shoulder due to the dense pine forests beside the roadway. I didn't ask many questions because the compensation was sufficient and the company needed someone to cover the route for a week while their normal driver recovered from surgery. I had taken many nighttime rides in the past, and I liked the peace and the way the world seemed to fit. When everyone else was asleep, it was just me. My midway point was the rest station at mile marker 47. Sitting on a gravel lot surrounded by trees is a modest concrete structure with a few vending machines and restrooms. I had previously made 2 unproblematic stops there that week, just long enough to get some coffee and stretch my legs before continuing on to the second half of my journey. I arrived around 2:30 a.m. on the third night. The only car on the property, except from at the further end, close to the tree line, was a dark car. Its location backed into an area facing the structure caught my attention. The car is still running, even if the headlights are off. Someone should not have been parked in that manner at this hour. They are not even sitting on one of the picnic spots strewn across the lot, just running their engine. The building's external lights were low, giving everything a yellowish hue that created shadows. Felt more substantial than they ought to have. The idea of who anyone would be meeting out here in the middle of nowhere at this hour felt uneasily in my chest, but I went inside anyway, telling myself it was probably just someone sleeping in their car or waiting to meet someone. The automated lights flickered on with a buzz that felt too loud in the quiet, but the restroom was empty. I sprayed water on my face and cleaned my hands. Additionally, I could see the entryway behind me mirrored in the glass when I looked up at the mirror. The door was a little off from how I had left it. I became aware that the car had moved at that point. Just relocated, not gone. Now parked 3 spots closer to the structure than I was when I entered. From this vantage point, I was still unable to see anyone in the driver's seat, and the engine was still running. Only the shadowy silhouette of the car, as if it was waiting for something. When I turned off the faucet, my hands were still wet, and the sudden quiet felt as though the building itself was holding its breath as the running water was replaced. Without glancing at the sedan, I made my way back outside at a speed I didn't want to acknowledge, and made my way to my truck. Every step seemed too loud and vulnerable in the open lot, as the gravel crunched beneath my boots. I was about 10 feet away from my vehicle when I heard a different sound. It was quiet but definite, and I could tell without looking that it was coming from the car. I continued walking without turning around, taking my keys out of my pocket with fingers that were slow and awkward. I heard footsteps behind me, moving across the gravel, in a determined beat that nearly exactly matched my own speed. They weren't sprinting, but they also weren't casual. Whoever it was, they were keeping the same distance, not getting closer, but also not falling behind. And in a way, that felt worse than if they had come straight to me. After arriving at my truck, I got inside, closed the door, and pressed the lock button so forcefully that my thumb ached. On the first attempt, the engine started, and I had never, in my 15 years of driving, reversed out of the space without properly checking my mirrors. My headlights brushed across the vehicle as I turned to head for the exit. I briefly caught a glimpse of the person standing next to it. A dark-clad figure facing me, hands at their sides, still, but too far away and too dimly lit for me to see any features. I watched the rest stop get smaller in my rear as I turned onto the highway and accelerated more than was necessary. View mirror until it was entirely engulfed by the woods. My hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly. My pulse was racing, and I kept looking in the mirror every few seconds, hoping to see headlights behind me. But the road remained dark. I didn't realize what had disturbed me the most about the entire situation until I was 20 meters down the highway. When I first parked into the lot, I took notice of the sedan's location close to the tree line and instinctively committed it to memory, just as when you're by yourself in a strange environment. However, it had relocated as I emerged from the building. However, I hadn't noticed anything else until now, since I had been so preoccupied with that particular feature. I had never heard the sedan move, but it had. The engine had been running the whole time, that constant, low idle that reverberated around the deserted lot. However, there had been no sign that the car had actually moved those 3 spots closer to the building. No engine roaring, no sound of tires on gravel. That evening, and the 3 evenings that followed, I completed my trip. But I began timing my excursions in order to cross mile marker 47 sooner rather than later, making sure to do it when there was at least a possibility that someone else may be present. I never made another overnight visit there, and I also never saw the vehicle again. However, on occasion during the day, I slowed down just enough to glance at the parking lot and consider the area close to the tree line where the automobile had been. There, the gravel appears unaltered and typical, just like everywhere else. However, I can't get rid of the thought that if I pulled in, and when I went to take a closer look, I discovered tire marks that began in one place and just appeared in another, with no path connecting them, giving the impression that the automobile had been lifted and planted rather than driven. I have no idea what I disrupted that evening, what would have occurred if I had stayed longer, or what would have happened if I had turned around when I heard those footsteps walking across the gravel at the same pace as me. Furthermore, I'm not sure if I want to know. What I do know is that the next week the company's normal driver returned. Additionally, when I transferred the course, I indicated that there was some quite weak illumination at the rest break at mile marker 47, that perhaps stopping there by yourself at night wasn't the safest option. After giving me a lengthy look, he informed me that he had been driving straight through that area for years. It made no difference if he needed to stretch or if he was exhausted. I didn't ask, and he didn't explain why. Every time I acknowledged it, the knocking stopped precisely 30 seconds later. Early in March, I moved into a little one-bedroom apartment on the ground level of an old converted home on the east side of town. The rent was so low that I didn't have to give it much thought. During the walkthrough, the landlord stated that even though the insulation wasn't ideal, the building had strong bones and a peaceful tenant who had lived in the unit above mine for years. He claimed, "I'd occasionally hear footsteps, but nothing too loud. Just the typical sounds of a person going about their daily life." The first week went well, with the exception of sporadic creaking and the muted sound of movement typical of an older structure with wooden floors. Most days, I worked from home. I spent a lot of time at my desk, working as a freelance editor. Additionally, I grew accustomed to the person above me's rhythm. They appeared to move around their flat at regular intervals. Footsteps in the morning, heavier movement about 7, indicating that cleaning was taking place on weekend afternoons, or that furniture was being moved. After that, there were peaceful evenings that continued throughout the night. I became aware of the knocking rhythm during the second week. Once a day, either in the morning or the afternoon, it would take place. No matter where I was sitting, there were always 3 distinct knocks that seemed to originate from the ceiling right above. I initially assumed it was a coincidence that the guy upstairs was doing small repairs or hanging photos. However, the knocking would soon start to move, I knew. I would get up and head to the kitchen if I heard it while sitting at my desk in the bedroom. I would hear it again in a matter of minutes, 3 knocks just above where I am now. Unintentionally, I began testing it by going from room to room and seeing if the pattern persisted. It did, each and every time. I heard 3 knocks that seemed to follow me throughout my apartment from above. Subsequently, I became aware of the second portion of the pattern, which caused my skin to feel cold and constricted. The knocking would cease precisely 30 seconds after I acknowledged it by looking up at the ceiling. I timed it several times, and each time it appeared as though someone upstairs was standing motionless and waiting for that particular amount of time to pass before leaving. I considered going upstairs to introduce myself, casually bring up the knocking, and observe how the person responded. But each time I thought about it, something stopped me. There were two entrances to the building, one for my ground-level flat and another outside stairway leading to the apartment on the second floor. I had lived there for 3 weeks, and I had never seen anyone utilize those stairs. When I returned home after dark, I had never seen lights turn on or off in the windows above my house, or heard a car pull up. I never saw anyone else putting out the garbage or checking their mail. The landlord had stated the tenant was silent, but something wasn't quite right. For example, there was someone living in the flat above me, but they were only ever heard knocking and footsteps. They were never really there in the world beyond these walls. One afternoon, I made the decision to work late at the coffee shop until nearly 8 o'clock before leaving for home. Additionally, I made sure to glance up at the windows on the second level as soon as I pulled into the tiny lot behind the building. As usual, they were dark. No television or bulb shine, no shadow passing through the window. After getting out of my car, I stood for a while, staring out those dark windows and experiencing an unidentified twist in my gut. I immediately went to the kitchen to make tea after setting down my bag inside my apartment, and I heard it 5 minutes later. There were 3 knocks just above me, just where I was standing at the counter. This time, I just kept my eyes on the kettle and didn't glance up. I mentally counted while I waited to see if the pattern would continue without my recognition. Once more, there was a knock. 3 more forceful hits in the same location. Then again and again, the pauses becoming shorter, until it seemed less like someone knocking and more like someone insisting that I glance up to make sure I knew they were there. With my hands trembling just enough to require careful typing, I reached for my phone and found the landlord's number. But the knocking ceased before I could press the call button. Silence descended over the flat until I could only hear my own breathing. Not gradually, not with the last knock that seemed to be the end. For 3 days, there was stillness. No movement, no knocking, no footsteps. There was only an emptiness above that, in some ways, was worse than always being aware of someone's presence. I cooked, worked at my desk, and watched TV at a low volume while the ceiling above me provided nothing. There was absolutely no sign that somebody was present in that area. I began to question whether I had imagined the entire situation, whether the loneliness of working from home had produced patterns where none had existed. However, I realized that wasn't it when I recalled the accuracy of it and the way the knocking had followed me. I discovered something on my porch after returning from a supermarket run on the 4th day of silence. An ancient brass key that appeared to be, instead of an outside lock, it belonged to an inner door. There was just the key on the concrete, as if someone had carefully placed it before leaving, with no sign or explanation. When I lifted it up, I could feel its weight in my palm, solid and genuine. Without giving it any thought, I proceeded to the opposite side of the building, where the outdoor stairs led to the apartment on the 2nd story. As I ascended to the landing at the top, the wooden stairs, which had been painted gray a long time ago, groaned beneath my weight. The upstairs apartment had a window placed into the upper half that was obscured from the inside by a thin curtain, and the door was dark green with some peeling paint. Through it, all I could see were hazy objects that might have been shadows, furniture, or nothing at all. Above the aged, tarnished brass doorknob was a keyhole that appeared to fit the key I was holding. I held the key and stared at the door for a while before realizing I couldn't hear anything from within. There was no breathing, no movement, and no sound of someone watching from the other side to see what I would do. There was complete silence, the kind that makes you conscious of your own heartbeat, and the way your clothing move when you move. The key was not used by me. After descending the stairs and entering my own apartment, I placed the key in the drawer of my bedside table, so I wouldn't have to see it. For the first time in 4 days, I heard footsteps above me that night, as I lay in bed, with the lights out, traveling in a straight line from one end of the flat to the other, stopping right above my bed. The following morning, the knocking began once more, the same pattern as previously. I was followed throughout my flat by 3 blows that stopped precisely 30 seconds after I acknowledged them. I considered giving the landlord another call, asking who lived upstairs, getting their name, phone number, or any other information that would make the person above me seem genuine and everyday, rather than something that only existed in connection with my presence below. However, a part of me was frightened of what he may say, or worse, what he might not say, so I didn't call. The trend has persisted every day for the past 6 months that I've been here. The sound of footsteps, knocking, and the sensation of being watched from above. The key remains undisturbed in my drawer, and occasionally in the middle of the night, I consider the possible consequences of using it upstairs. What may I discover in that seemingly empty apartment? I also consider the timing. The knocking always ceases precisely 30 seconds after I look up, and if I didn't glance up, I wonder what would happen. Would it get worse if I fully disregarded it and refused to accept the presence above? Would the knocking become more frequent and louder? Or would it completely stop, leaving me by myself in a building where I shouldn't be? However, I haven't tested that yet, because I can't stop thinking about another possibility. One that, on some evenings, when the apartment above me is finally quiet, keeps me awake. What if the knock is intended to comfort me, that someone is there, keeping an eye on me and making sure I'm not forgotten, rather than to disturb me? If such is the case, what will happen if the knocking ceases permanently, when the apartment above me becomes silent, not for a few days, but permanently? I still occasionally scroll past, but I never open it again. After nearly 3 years of using the same phone, I eventually made the decision to go through my camera roll and remove the fuzzy pictures and screenshots that had gathered over time. I was sitting at my kitchen table on a rainy Saturday afternoon in April, swiping through hundreds of photos I had entirely forgotten about, as my coffee was becoming cold next to me. I had taken images of my car's registration plate for a forgotten form, old receipts for expenditure reports, and miscellaneous images of product labels and street signs that had looked significant at the time. I discovered the incorrect photo about halfway through. The timestamp said that picture was taken at 2:47 in the morning, 3 months prior, and it featured my bedroom from a perspective I had never taken before. The picture was taken gazing in at my bed from the doorway. The view was somewhat skewed, as if the phone had been held at waist height instead of eye level. My lamp by my bed was on in the picture, creating the cozy circle of light I always left on when I couldn't go asleep. I could also make out the edge of my comforter and the book I had been reading that week, which was resting face down on the nightstand. I couldn't remember having my coffee, which caused me to gaze at the screen until it turned cold. I thought I remembered that night. I recalled turning off the lamp at around 3 after reading till my eyes ached while lying in bed. However, I couldn't recall receiving up. I didn't recall taking that specific picture of my own room while standing in my doorway with my phone. I looked at the metadata, wondering if the date was incorrect or if the picture had been copied from somewhere else. The location information verified that it had been taken inside my flat. The file size was typical, and the resolution matched that of my phone's camera. Technically, there was nothing wrong with the picture. Nothing that implied that it had been altered or tampered with, but a picture that I had obviously snapped and forgotten about. Working backward from the timestamp, I attempted to recall that night more vividly, considering what I had done that evening and whether I had woken up for any reason that may account for me wandering to my doorway with my phone. I couldn't think of anything. Simply reading in bed and finally falling asleep, as is customary. And the void in my recollection seemed more like something that had been meticulously taken out. Over the course of the following few days, I noticed that I kept thinking about the picture at strange times, such during business calls, supermarket shopping, and the quiet times right before bed. I would take another look at my camera roll, examining the specifics, searching for something I had overlooked that would provide context for the entire situation. The viewpoint at waist level that seemed someone was casually, almost carelessly, holding a phone rather than purposefully framing a shot was the angle that most upset me. My palms became numb, and my breath caught in my throat when I saw the second detail. There was an indentation in the duvet on the left side of my bed, where I usually slept, that was hardly noticeable in the warm lamplight. However, the impression was not hollow. Beneath the covers, there was a shape that might have been an odd arrangement of pillows or something else entirely. And the more I examined it, the more certain I was that I was seeing the outline. In an attempt to persuade myself that I was mistaken, and that the cloth had just bunched up, or that shadows were manipulating the image quality, I zoomed in until the pixels began to disintegrate. However, the shape was too precise and too similar to the dimensions of a human person lying on its side with its back to the camera, exactly where I would have been asleep at 2:47 in the morning. My legs felt unsteady, so I had to sit on my couch when my phone fell out of my hands. If I was sleeping in bed, or at least, who had snapped the picture when they were lying down? And if I had taken it, I couldn't recall a bizarre sleepwalking event. So why had I taken pictures of myself in bed from the doorway, as if I were recording proof of something? I considered erasing the picture, simply swiping it away, and never thinking about it again. But I was unable to get myself to do so. Rather, I relocated the picture to a folder in my Files app, so I wouldn't view it by accident while looking through recent photos. And I made an effort to return to my regular schedule. But suddenly, especially at night, normal seemed odd. I began to notice things that I had never noticed before, such as the fact that my phone would be on the other side of my nightstand from where I had left it, screen down rather than screen up, or that my bedroom door would be open in the morning, even though I was positive I had closed it before going to bed. Minor discrepancies that might have been caused by simple forgetfulness or disturbed sleep, however. They piled up in my head like proof of something I didn't want to admit. One night, I angled the camera on my laptop to record my bedroom doorway while I slept. I went through 6 hours of video in the morning, watching the timestamp advance while nothing happened. Only my dimly lit lamp seeping into the frame and my dimly lit entryway. Even though I had no notion, I felt both relieved and sad since I had sought evidence of anything. What I was searching for. I was holding my phone when I woke up at 3 in the morning, the third week after discovering the picture. My camera app was displayed on the screen, but I couldn't recall picking it up or unlocking it. In an instant, I was sitting up straight in bed, completely awake, gazing at the bright rectangle of light in my palm, and attempting to piece together the last few seconds, minutes, or whatever long I had been holding it. The camera app displayed my most recent picture, which was shot 30 seconds ago. Additionally, even though my bedroom was warm, as I gazed at it, my skin became cold. I could see myself in it, laying on my side with my eyes closed and one arm extended across the pillow. It was another picture of my room, this time taken from the foot of my bed and facing the headboard. With trembling hands, I looked through my camera roll and saw 4 additional pictures from the previous hour, all of which showed my bedroom from various perspectives and featured me dozing off in different positions. A series was created by the timestamps, one picture every 15 minutes or so, as if someone had been walking around my room while I was unconscious and snapping pictures. However, my apartment was empty. The windows were closed, the door was locked, and every picture depicted an empty room, save for me, dozing off, without realizing I was being filmed. I got up and looked behind my shower curtain, under my bed, and in every room and closet, all the potential hiding spots. However, I was by myself. And because it implied that whatever was going on was something I was doing to myself without realizing it, it seemed worse in some way than discovering proof of an invader. I tried to fall back asleep after erasing all the new pictures. However, I kept thinking about those pictures, the timing, the perspectives, and the meticulous recording of my own unconscious shape. I scheduled an appointment with my doctor the next morning, believing that there might be a medical explanation for the complicated behaviors that occurred during the night, such as parasomnia or a sleep disorder. I made the decision to postpone the visit for 2 weeks in order to see if it would recur, or if it was merely a single incident caused by stress, medication, or some other combination of things I hadn't thought of. I haven't discovered any new pictures on my phone in the 4 days since that evening. I haven't seen it in odd places or woken up clutching it. Everything appears to be back to normal, the same procedure as previously. And whatever it was, a part of me wants to think it's over. However, I've developed an obsessive habit of going through my camera roll several times a day in search of photos I don't recall taking. Additionally, I always make sure that my phone is fully turned off and positioned across the room so that I would have to get out of bed to use it before going to bed. I'm not sure how to describe this without coming across as either dishonest or out of touch with reality, so I haven't told anyone. And perhaps I am. Perhaps it is the most straightforward explanation. That my brain is malfunctioning, causing memory gaps and uncontrollable behaviors. However, the waist-level position and the casual manner the phone must have been handled come to mind when I look back at that original picture, the one from 3 months ago that initiated all of this, and I wonder whether this has been going on for a longer period of time than I realize. If my camera roll is filled with pictures I've learned not to look at, if I scrolled all the way back, I wonder what I would discover.